In this video, we will show you how to replace your bearing hub on this Ford Fusion. When doing so, the bearing typically will be destroyed. Make sure you have a brand new one. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing you have to do is safely raise and support your vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've done so, we'll continue on with removing all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. To remove your nut, you're typically going to find that you have some sort of locking cotter pin. Go ahead and remove that cotter pin, and then we'll remove the nut from the area. Use a 19mm to remove this nut. Once you have that off of there, just give it a quick inspection. Start it back on a couple threads. At this point, we're going to separate the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. I have the nut on here as a safety precaution, so when I tap on this knuckle, the tie rod will come down, but it can only come down so far. Broke free after a couple bunks. Quick inspection, make sure you didn't damage the tie rod end in any way. Set that nut aside. Make your way to your axle nut. We'll be using our 32mm socket. If you find this spins on you, have a second person in the passenger compartment step on the brake while you remove the nut. Let's continue on with a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle. We'll break this free. Once you have movement from this area, we'll continue on. The next thing we'll have to do is carefully try making our way inside here with a pry bar. We're going to pry up against the caliper and the rotor and try to press back the caliper piston, just enough that we have a little bit of movement, releasing pressure from the brake rotor. While I make my way in here to pry, I'll also be holding along the far side of the rotor, and I'll carefully try to do this. You don't need to go very far here. Once you have a tiny bit of movement, that should be good enough. Now let's pivot this and have a look along the backside. We're going to be looking for our two 15mm headed caliper bracket bolts. Carefully remove the upper one, give it a quick inspection, and start it back in just a couple threads. After that, we'll fully remove the lower bolt. Double check to make sure it's not rotted or damaged in any way. At this point, we're going to continue on to fully removing the caliper from the area. It's a good idea to quickly inspect those brake pads. We'll set this aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose. Continue on to dislodging your ABS wire bracket from the steering knuckle. We'll use a 10mm for this mounting bolt. Quick inspection. Go ahead and separate that. Follow the ABS wire down along the rear of the knuckle here. We're going to remove our 10mm headed mounting bolt that holds this in place. Take hold of the sensor, give it a little wiggle. Carefully remove it from the area, give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Let's take that ABS wire and we'll tie it up and out of the way. Remove the brake rotor from the area by removing these two T40 Torx screws. Once you have those bolts off of there, take hold of the rotor and remove it. If it's stuck in place, you can carefully tap along this area with a hammer, but be extremely careful not to damage the threaded area on your studs or the braking surface. Quick inspection, set it aside. Continue on, applying light pressure underneath your knuckle. Make your way to your upper ball joint. We'll use a 17mm to remove this nut. Once you have that out of place, give it a quick inspection, start it back on just a couple threads. At this point, we're going to separate this. To separate this, you could carefully use a hammer and tap along this area of the knuckle. Be careful for damaging your ball joint, either the boot or the threaded area. Let's pause here and make our way to our lower ball joints. At this point, we're going to move our support underneath this portion of the control arm. Let's apply upward pressure. Let's move along to this 24mm nut. Now we can remove the lower ball joint 24mm nut. Start this on a couple threads. Let's use some penetrant in this area. Now that we've sprayed that down, the next thing we'll have to do is start breaking these free. To do so, you want to be extremely careful not to damage the threaded area or the protective boot up along the top. If you were to look in the center of the stud, you will find that it has a small hole that you could use a hammer and punch and carefully try to break this free. Otherwise, you can continue on with your 24mm nut, start that on there a few good threads. Now we'll use this area to break this free. This could come apart in a couple different ways. Commonly, the joint area will slide out of the bushing. Otherwise, the bushing might slide out of this knuckle. One way or the other, we have to separate this joint. We'll continue on. Looks as though ours is separating the bushing from the knuckle. At this point, we're going to continue on by causing vibration along this area of the knuckle. What should happen is that the knuckle will want to come down away from the lower ball joint. Continue on with the separator tool. Okay, this is starting to separate. We'll be extremely careful at this point because this will want to drop down. Remove your tool. Take hold of the knuckle and the upper control arm. We'll continue on to removing that 17mm mounting nut. As we continue pulling this down and away, we'll be very careful for our axle. At this point, we'll take the knuckle over to the press. We want to make sure we have this as level to the ground as possible so we can continue on applying pressure on the backside of the hub. The hub is this area here. When applying pressure, we only want to press along the center area, not on the bearing itself. We will cause damage. Double check to make sure everything's properly aligned and continue on applying pressure. Let's temporarily remove this from the press. Get it over to the bench so we can remove our snap ring along the front. On the bench, let's have a close look along the front here. You will find you have a snap ring. To remove the snap ring, you find that you have two ears. You can use snap ring pliers, squeeze them together and remove the snap ring. If it's stuck in place, we'll just break it free with a hammer and chisel. We'll tap around this to try to break the rust free. Once we've done so, we typically can grab onto these two ears, squeeze them together. If it's stuck in place, you can continue on with a hammer and chisel. There we are. Let's get this back in our press unit. At this point, we're pressing along the backside again. We're going to be pressing the entire bearing out of the knuckle. Make sure you have it in a steady position. We'll find an adapter that fits directly over this area. Align it as level as possible and drive it down and through. let's continue on with installing our bearing. On this particular bearing, you don't really have to worry about which way you place it in. You just want to make sure it's as level as possible. At this point, we'll continue on by pressing it down. When doing so, looking along the top here, you're going to find that you have 3 rings. You have the outer portion, the center portion, which is protecting the bearings on the inside, and then you have the inner race. When pressing it down, we only want to press up against the outer shell here, never against the center or against the center ring. Got a cup that fits directly over that. We'll continue on by pressing this down into position. Let's pay attention along the top here. You can tell that the bearing is pretty much flush with this end of the hub. We actually need to bring the bearing down a little further so it's bottomed out against the inner portion of the hub, and we can put in our snap ring. Let's continue a little further. While holding pressure in this area, let's cause some vibration. Clean up the area, install your lock ring. At this point, we'll continue on with our snap ring. Take this and slide it inside of the groove of the knuckle. That will be holding the bearing in place. We'll start down along one side and continue on by rolling it around. Otherwise, you could use your snap ring pliers, squeeze the 2 ears together and press it in. There we go. Now once you have it in here, you just want to double check to make sure it's completely seated. Let's get this back over to the press. Now over at the press, this part's very important. We want to pay attention along the back side of the knuckle where we just pressed the bearing into. We need to make sure we only press against the inner race. You remember I showed you on the bearing itself, you had an inner race, you had the center protective cap, and then you also had the outer portion. We're only going to be holding against the inner race now. Find an adapter that fits directly up against only that, and then make sure you're holding the bearing in that position, up against that only. Once you feel as though you have it lined up, we can continue on with our hub. Align everything as evenly as possible, and we'll continue on by pressing this in. Once we have everything aligned up here, we're going to pay attention quickly down along the bottom just to double check that we have the center race properly aligned. That looks good. Let's apply pressure and continue forcing this all the way down until it bottoms out. While I was bringing this down, I can hear an audible difference. Confirm in between here that you are completely bottomed out. Release pressure. One last check, and we'll get this back over to the vehicle. If your bushings are stuck on your ball joint studs, you're going to have to remove each of them. When we're doing the installation process, you will have to press those bushings into the steering knuckle before you install the knuckle into the vehicle. We'll continue on with the removal tool. For this, it has 2 ears, which will go over the top of the bushing, and the center will drive up against the lower aspect here. We're being very careful not to damage the threading. We'll apply pressure and continue on with driving this out of place. Now that we have that one off of there, let's do the exact same thing to the other bushing. Now keep in mind, when removing these bushings, the rear bushing will need to go back in the rear mounting hole. Let's continue on to cleaning up the areas on the knuckle where the bushings will go. It's important to make sure you clean up the base area where the bushing will press directly against, and also clean the inner ports. Use a wire brush. You can also use some fine sandpaper. Continue on with our rag, clean those ports. Give those a close inspection. It's not a good idea to use sandpaper inside this area because we do not want to remove any of the material. You could have an issue with the bushing. Quick inspection on both of those. These feel good. Now it's time to install our bushings. The process for one is the exact same thing as the other. Take the bushing and rest it in place along the top of the knuckle. Continue on with a ball joint press. We're going to continue by pressing this bushing all the way into the knuckle, making sure that the base area of the bushing is bottomed out against the knuckle. If you don't have a ball joint press, you could also tap this in with a hammer. When you're driving it in, you just want to confirm that you are completely bottomed out. I can tell right along here, it does need to go in a little further. There it is, nice and seated. Do the same to the other bushing. Let's get our knuckle back over towards the vehicle. We'll be taking the axle shaft and sliding it through the backside of the bearing. While doing so, we also need to align each one of those ball joints with their corresponding bushing on the bottom of the steering knuckle. Get that axle aligned. Swing this over. Once you have both of those started in, pause down there. Make your way to your upper ball joint. We'll swing this into position. If you find you have a hard time lining it up, it could potentially be because your axle is binding up on the inside of the wheel bearing. Continue on with your locking nut. Now we'll pause up there and make our way to the outer tie rod end. For the outer tie rod end, we're only taking this and putting it in place so it holds everything steady for us. We'll just start the nut on there. Make your way to the upper ball joint nut. We'll snug this and torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Make your way to your two lower ball joint nuts. Let's make our way down to the two lower nuts. Snug these and torque them to 148 foot-pounds. Let's continue on with our ABS wire. We'll take this and put it in and behind the knuckle. Align your mounting bracket across this area. You will find that it has a small locating tab that'll fit into its corresponding hole. Align the mounting bolt hole. At this point, we'll continue on with our mounting bolts. You'll find that you have two different size mounting bolts for this. The smaller one is for the upper mounting point, and the larger one is for the lower mounting point. Go ahead and start that in and snug it up. Making our way to where the ABS sensor connects onto the knuckle, you will find another locating point. You just go ahead and slide that right into the hole, align your mounting bolt. Start that in, snug it up, torque it to 15 foot-pounds. At this point, we can remove the nut and the tie rod end from the knuckle. Let's continue on with some anti-seize on the hub mating surface. Let's install the brake rotor. Before we put in the mounting bolts, just go ahead and give it a quick twist here. We're listening for any type of grinding noise. If you hear any noise, typically that would be from the backing plate hitting up against the backside of the rotor. Just go ahead and pull that out of place and give it a quick check. Continue on with your two Torx head mounting bolts. Start them in, snug them up. Slide the brake caliper into place. Align your two caliper bracket mounting bolt holes. Start in those bolts. Now that they're started in, we'll snug them up and torque them to 66 foot-pounds. Let's take this and slide it into the steering knuckle. Slide it up in there. Continue on with your castle nut. We'll be taking this, start it on there by hand. Snug it up, torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Once you've torqued this to 35 foot-pounds, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the small hole that makes its way through the tie rod stud and the corresponding slots on the mounting nut. We want to try to have the slots aligned with the hole, and then we'll slide through a locking cotter pin. If for some reason the slot is not aligned with the hole, continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. Let's continue on to our axle nut. Go ahead and take that, start it on there by hand and snug it up. Do not use an impact wrench to tighten this mounting nut. You could cause damage to the bearing. Now it's time to torque the axle nut. To do this, it might be easiest using a pry bar coming diagonally across the studs down towards the ground. That'll prevent this from spinning. Once you've done so, we'll be torquing this to 189 foot-pounds. After that, we'll peen the nut into the corresponding slot on the axle shaft. We'll continue with our hammer and punch, drive this down and in. With having that peened in, this nut should not be able to loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Install your wheel. We'll start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts, bottom them out. Get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and then we'll torque each of these lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel back on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we've got our vehicle back together. At this point, take it for a road test, listen for funny noises, make sure you don't have an ABS light, and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Aside from that, thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.